defending the free market, and making the moral case for capitalism. The Justin Moore Show. Hey everybody, welcome to the Justin Moore Show. I am Justin Moore. Okay guys, well, Freedom Fest starts tomorrow when this episode comes out. And so the Freedom Fest is July 13th through the 16th. And so I hope many of you can make it. I am going to be moderating a panel. And Freedom Fest, as you guys all know, I've interviewed Dr. Mark Skousen talking about Freedom Fest. It's in Las Vegas. It's at Planet Hollywood. There's going to be a ton of people there, all sorts of great speakers. And I'm moderating a panel there on Austrian economics. We're going to be talking about all the bubbles going on in the economy right now, interest rates, what's the Fed going to do next, inflation, all sorts of good stuff. And joining me on the panel, we have Gene Epstein, Adrian Day, Robert Murphy, Chris Casey, and Keith Weiner. And the last three guys I just mentioned, you guys all know, they've all been former guests on my show here. And so it's going to be a great panel. I hope you guys can join me. And so it's going to be a good time. So if you guys still are not convinced about going to Freedom Fest, you better go next year, dang it. I'm telling you, you're missing out, okay? Well, anyway, guys, that's my one little announcement I wanted to mention before starting up here. I found a good piece here from John Tamney, and I think I've mentioned this and talked about this a little bit before, kind of talking about stadiums and, all these big sports stadiums going up, and they're just a giant boondoggle. And basically Tamney's piece, he's relating that, the stadiums to supply-side economics and government waste and so forth. So I'm actually going to be reading most of this piece. I think he does a really good job kind of laying stuff out. And, I mean, it really is a disaster, and we're going to get to that here. And let's just start off here. When the Texas Rangers opened their state-of-the-art baseball stadium in 1994, then Rangers president Tom Schieffer told reporters, "I will know I failed if 30 years from now there has to be discussions in Arlington about building a new stadium." It turns out Schieffer failed. 22 years later, the Rangers are moving ahead with a new retractable roof baseball stadium. The cost of this latest attempt to allegedly keep up with Major League Baseball's Joneses will be $1 billion, half of that coming from the city of Arlington. Importantly, Arlington is hardly alone. Both the Falcons, NFL team, and Braves, MLB team, in Atlanta are building new stadiums too, despite both having moved into new ones in the 1990s. It's all part of a relentless stadium building boom, largely paid for by taxpayers. As the Wall Street Journal recently reported, between 1990 and 2010, roughly $34 billion was spent on sports facilities in the United States, and $20 billion of the amount came from public sources. Okay, let's get that last part right here. So between the years of 1990 to 2010, the government, taxpayers, spent $20 billion on new sports stadiums. And during that same time period, a total amount on these stadiums was $34 billion spent, okay? So basically almost 60% of the money spent on stadiums for a 20-year period came from taxpayers. Talk about a boondoggle. These sports franchises, they have their billionaire owners, their multi-million-dollar players. There's these franchises, they make a lot of money. And you're telling me these guys, they can't pay for their own stadiums? Well, actually they can. And the Green Bay Packers, I think they have the best model of anybody. The Green Bay Packers, they're run like a corporation. People buy publicly traded stock into the franchise. You can't necessarily buy it on the stock market, but there is publicly traded stock with the Green Bay Packers. And so with that concept in mind, what does that mean? That means the fans own the team. What a freaking concept, right? Doesn't that make the most sense? That these giant sports stadiums should be owned by the team. Look at all of these people. I'm sure you guys know these guys. And there are some people right around my area. And actually, I've heard stories from this one guy. He's a very wealthy individual who lives around Billings in Montana here. And he's big into sports. I can't remember what jersey it is he wears, but apparently he's got a closet full of jerseys. And so, I mean, this guy makes millions of dollars a year, but he wears a sports jersey. It's some NFL team. I can't remember if it's like the Eagles or whatever it was. But he wears a sports jersey every single day. I mean, there's some of these people that are like that. They're such big fans of the game that they're always wearing their jersey. They have all that sports memorabilia, all the license plates. They got the sports team on it, the bumper stickers, you name it. People, they love their sports teams. And so doesn't it make the most sense that these giant fans, they're going to be the ones who want to do as much as they can for their team to be able to buy stock into that team so you actually have ownership? Private property? Yeah. I mean, you actually have a lot more at risk at that point because you literally own part of the sports franchise. And that's how things should be run with these giant sports boondoggle. And that's the thing. Like, you look at all these sports commentators, your ESPN, you name it. A lot of those guys are damn socialists, I mean, there is a lot of government funding that goes into this stuff, and it doesn't make sense with all these billionaire owners, and they're the most well-to-do people out there, and they're being subsidized by the government. But then we have Bernie Sanders and all these guys. We need a $15 minimum wage, and we need to have more socialism. Well, I mean, really, how the NFL is, and I mean, they really are socialist enterprises to a large extent. Let's continue on to Tammy's piece here. The unrelenting rise of mega stadiums is a loud reminder of why tax reform is only good if it actually leads to lower government revenues. Invariably, local and national politicians talk of tax plans that will be revenue neutral, or worse, ones that will actually lead to higher revenues. But the goal should always be rates that reduce what governments collect. For the longest time, members of the supply-side school of economic thought have promoted their income and capital gains tax cuts as a way to generate more revenue for politicians. Empirically, they've been correct. As the 1920s, 60s, 80s, and 90s, a big capital gain tax cut in 1997 reveal quite well when the government tax rate burden is reduced, economic activity increases. With that increase, so do government revenues. About supply-side economics, it should be said with great certainty that it's a tautology. In order to demand, we must supply first. So the focus should always be on removing the tax, regulatory, trade, tariffs, and monetary unstable money values, barriers to production. If so, prosperity will zoom upward. About tax rate cuts, it should also be said that rate reduction should always be the purpose of any tax legislation. The obvious problem, however, has been that these rate cuts have been too successful from a tax revenue standpoint. As the revenues flowing into the government have increased, so has the waste. Nothing against sports or professional sports leagues, but gleaming new stadiums built on the backs of taxpayers speak to monumental government waste. And you know what? John brings up a lot of good points here. The supply-siders, they've always been about cutting taxes. But the reason they want to cut taxes, according to the Laffer curve, that basically says, as you cut taxes, essentially, you can increase revenues to the government. Or, I mean, to really take it to an extreme, a tax rate's at 0%, the government takes nothing in, and tax rates at 100%, the government takes nothing in. So you gotta, obviously you have to be in between there. But the supply-siders have always focused on trying to cut taxes so that they can increase revenues to the government. And John Towney makes a great point here that, okay, yeah, the government, sure, it gets this money, these increased revenues, but the government spends all these revenues. They piss it away on stadiums and everywhere else they can attract a block of voters by appealing to different constituencies. That's how these local politicians do it. Prior to election year, we got to go put some riders into bills that is good for, your local constituency. And I mean, that is just how the system works today. And that's why so many people are disgusted with that. Well, if you're the one being bought off, well then, you love it, Someone else that's receiving some subsidy in some sort of activity that you don't engage in, you're all about trying to cut that guy's subsidy, right? Well, yeah, that's part of the problem. We're always willing to point fingers at someone else. But let's continue on with Tammy's piece. In that case, and with the good of tax cuts very much in mind, the focus should either be on reducing rates so much that revenues into local and national governments actually decline, or very specific plans to return to taxpayers any revenue increases that spring from rate cuts. Politicians invariably spend the revenues that come in, and government spending amounts to politicians irrigating resources without any market discipline. By extension, government spending is very much a barrier to and a tax on economic growth. Simply because when they spend, politicians are consuming limited resources that would more likely morph into capital for entrepreneurs and business absent their consumption by governments. Yeah, Tammy is absolutely right. Government spending is a barrier to, and it's a tax on economic growth. We wonder why our economy took so long to recover, back during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And if you read books on the Great Depression, by Burton Folsom, like New Deal or Raw Deal, and there's several others out there that are really great, or like Dr. Robert Murphy, who I've had on my show and who will be on my panel at Freedom Fest. He wrote a book talking about the Great Depression, and I strongly recommend that would be a great first book for you to start on if you haven't read any. But basically, during the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican, but he's a lot of similarities to George Bush, interestingly enough, he decided that, we're not going to treat this crisis like any other crisis before it. We're going to have government stimulus. We need the government to step in. And there's quotes from Herbert Hoover saying that they're doing something they've never done before. It's there. And that's why it's not accurate when you hear a bunch of liberals saying, oh, how Herbert Hoover was this, this big time conservative guy, small government, libertarian type almost, He was nothing of the sort. He actually jacked up tax rates prior to the Great Depression also. And all the bad things that Herbert Hoover did, FDR, he doubled down on what Herbert Hoover did. He continued to raise taxes. He spent more money. He continued on with and expanded all of the government programs that Herbert Hoover started. Hoover Dam, that giant government project is named after Herbert Hoover. All these jobs projects. This is Keynesian economics before Keynesian economics really got its name. But then, like with the Great Depression, FDR was president from 1933 to 45 when he died, and we were still in the Great Depression. And then it wasn't until after World War II, which, people get that wrong, saying that, oh yeah, it was World War II that got us to the Great Depression, because after we, people were gone away from the war, we saw, unemployment rates come down. So obviously that was the reason that we recovered, because a low unemployment rate means there's more prosperity. No, that's not right. The government budget was cut by more than half following the war. And what happened? Was there a Great Depression like Keynesians would predict? And they did predict? No. We had unprecedented prosperity. So that just goes to show you all what the government was doing was making matters worse. And a recent example, look at 2008. What has the government done since 2008? Here we are. It was 8 years ago. That's hard to believe. That was 8 years ago that we were in the housing crisis of 2008 and all the bailouts and everything else. What the government has done since then is they just continue to spend money to beat hell. And the key point is, when the government spends money, where does the government get that money? Well, obviously it comes from taxpayers. They have to take money from the private sector first. So how can the private sector recover when the government's taking money from us? We can't. And that is a big reason why these government stimulus bills, these jobs bills, all these other sort of bills, all these sort of responses where government's the answer, that's a reason why they're preventing us from bringing our economy into a recovery. The government is hindering a recovery. But no, the Federal Reserve, the government, they don't see it that way. And most voters out there don't see it that way. They think, oh, well, yeah, the government just needs more programs, obviously, but that is getting in the way of a recovery. And that's exactly what John Tamny, that's the point he's making here, that government spending is a barrier and it's a tax on economic growth. Now let's continue on with his piece here. All of the above in mind, the problem with rising government revenues is that they not only make it easier for politicians to spend, but they also make it easier for them to borrow so that they can spend even more. Stated very simply, abundant revenues for governments make the bonds governments float to build stadiums rather attractive investments. And it's not just stadiums. Medicare achieved funding as a $3 billion program in 1965. after the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts of 1964 showered the U.S. Treasury with extra revenues. 50 years later, Medicare still hasn't succeeded in providing universal medical care to seniors, but its annual cost is projected to soar over $1 trillion by the 2020s. Rising government revenues always and everywhere lead to government spending surges that take on a life of their own. Extra government revenues are the only real multiplier whereby the tax that is spending on programs grows exponentially once started. Rising government revenues are themselves a tax that neuter the undeniable good of tax cuts. And just that last statement he mentioned right there, rising government revenues are themselves a tax that neuter the undeniable good of tax cuts. Look at George W. Bush. He cut, the Bush tax cuts of 2003. What did Bush do? He spent money to beat hell. He was the biggest spending president since LBJ, since the Great Society, the guy who started Medicare, Medicaid. And let's continue on. I just have one last, basically just a few sentences left from his piece here. The driver of this ultimately comes down to excessive government revenues. So long as taxpayers hand over excessive income to government, it will be easy for those same governments to fund sports theme parks that have nothing to do with economic growth. As such, the logical goal of any kind of tax writing scheme should be one of tax rates so low that revenues actually decline. It's time to toss the Laffer curve and any other kind of tax scheme meant to increase revenues into the dustbin of history. All right, well, I love how Tamny concludes this piece here. We need to lower tax rates so much that government revenues actually fall. Yeah, now that's something that's controversial, right? Could you imagine a presidential candidate? Could you imagine Trump mentioning that statement to Hillary Clinton in a presidential debate? Like Hillary's like, oh yeah, we got to increase revenues to the government. That's the problem if we just got to tax the rich. And if Donald Trump just came back and he's like, no, we need to decrease revenues. No, we need to cut tax rates so low the government receives less. Do any politicians talk like that today? No, they don't. Both sides are trying to increase revenues to the government. We don't want to increase revenues to the government because, as Tamny eloquently pointed out in this piece, when the government gets more revenue, gets an increase in revenue, they spend it. It's gone. No, they spend it and some. Because we're always in deficits, right? So it doesn't matter how much we increase government revenues, the government will always spend more. And what do I say is one of the biggest problems that we have today? All of our problems are related to we have too big a government. The government just continues to grow. And if you want to cut taxes to increase revenues to the government, that's not solving the problem because the government's going to spend it. That is not the problem. And so that is why when these liberals point out, like Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, that, we'll see it's the wage gap and we just tax the rich, we can close these deficits. No, that's exactly my point, this whole episode, and Tamny's point on this piece here. That doesn't work. That is not going to solve the problem. The Laffer curve, was basically designed to prove that you can increase government revenue from cutting taxes. It was, Art Laffer, he was in the Reagan administration. He famously drew his little Laffer curve on a napkin at some restaurant somewhere. And basically the Laffer curve is what the Reagan Revolution was built on, and they're all about cutting taxes to increase government revenues. Well, did we shrink the size of government during Reagan's 8 years in office? No, we didn't. The government grew. The government grew a lot. And obviously people make the point, well, Justin, we were in a Cold War and, and a lot of it was spent on military. Okay. But still, the government grew. And we can debate that a different day. Now, there has been a few times when the government budget actually has shrunk. For instance, when Calvin Coolidge was president, the government budget actually shrank. Yes, it did. And so there's a reason I named my dog Calvin, for crying out loud. Calvin, my friends, yes, he was named after the 30th president of the United States, Silent Cal. I know, that's kind of a nerdy thing to do, isn't it? Well, you know what? I am not ashamed to be a student of history, okay? And you know what, guys? That's all I have for you today. We'll keep it a little bit shorter today. I thank you guys so much for just being here. If you're at Freedom Fest, you can come say hi to me. I'll be walking around, roaming around. I'll find some time for blackjack. I won't have all that much time, but hey, yeah, it's going to be a blast. I really hope you guys can join me there. I guess apparently John Stossel will not be making it this year, which is unfortunate, but I've seen him the last 2 years there. But for any of you newcomers, that'll be kind of sad. You won't get to experience that. But you know what, guys? You can help support me at my show here. Just go to justinmooreshow.com. More is spelled M-O-H-R. Just click on the little Amazon widget. Purchase your goods through my Amazon link. I get a very small commission back. Helps me out. And doesn't cost you anything extra. So, it's a win-win right here, okay? And it's not inconvenient at all. My website is so easy to navigate. Some people's websites are just littered with ads. No, not mine. Bam, right there. So, please just go there. You can check out old episodes through my website there. If you guys want to donate to me directly, just click on the little PayPal widget there right by the Amazon one. And as I've mentioned several times before on my show, if you do make a donation of $50 or more, I will send you 2 of my bonus episodes that I have. The last one it's over an hour long, and it talks about how you can save a ton of money going to Vegas. And I show you all sorts of things. I break it all down. So again, guys, thanks. I will talk with all you guys next week, and I'm looking forward to it. This is Justin Moore signing off.